if we have a multipolar world, the era of NATO is over. The era of enlargement of NATO is over.
Yes, I think so. I think that what the Russians have done in Ukraine is that they have drawn a clear line.
Welcome in our program. This is 42nd parallel, which is actually the coordinates of Georgia. And so I'm welcoming you to Tbilisi, to Georgia, on this special occasion of this forum, which is discussing the global affairs and international relations, and that's what I would like to discuss with you. And thanks for your time. And first of all, I would like to ask you about where are we right now after the, this is kind of the local question and also the global one, because recently we have observed the kind of steps towards the negotiations in Ukrainian conflict. So, but on the other hand, a lot of analysts said that after the first meeting, it was expected that the tensions would be increased, and we faced that. We faced the rocket launches from the Russian side, we faced these attacks of drones to Russian military bases, Crimea bridge, etc., etc. So how can we say, are we closer to settlement of the conflict, or we are far away from that, or maybe we are even next to the new phase of the conflict? What do you think about that?
Well, the first thing to say is that I'm very happy to be here in Tbilisi, in Georgia, and to say thank you for hosting me in this beautiful city. About the conflict in Ukraine and where we are with this conflict at the moment, my own view is that the conflict is coming towards its end. It is going to be a very complicated process reaching that end point. But two things have happened. Firstly, I think that the United States, and this goes beyond the person of Donald Trump, I think it is a widespread understanding in the United States, has come to realize that whatever military or geopolitical objective it might have had in Ukraine is unachievable now. That the Russians have withstood the sanctions shock, that the military pressure on Russia was unsuccessful, and by contrast that the Russian military pressure is becoming increasingly successful in a way that will impact on the United States itself if some sort of negotiated solution is not found. Now, it is very common in conflicts of this kind, when that realization begins, for there to be a huge amount of maneuvering between the various sides. So the Americans still want to see whether they can persuade the Russians to compromise further than the Russians are prepared to compromise. So the Russians, for their part, are pushing back. They're making clear what their demands are. The Americans are still trying to put pressure on the Russians to come to some kind of concessions. Each side is taking steps on the battlefields to improve its position and to assert its strength and to demonstrate its strength. But if you follow conflict settlement, you will know that this is not unusual. It was similar in Korea, in Vietnam, in other conflicts like this. Probably, eventually, maybe in a year's time, it won't happen quickly, we will get to a situation where there will be some kind of negotiated solution, but it's more likely to be one between Russia and the United States than it is likely to be between Russia and Ukraine.
But in that regard, what is the process in Istanbul? Is it kind of, if there is no solution between Ukraine and Russia, and because of the demands of the parts, I can understand it, but why they are meeting there? Why are they wasting time?
They're not wasting time. They are meeting there because the Russians are putting forward proposals which, when you examine them carefully, are more addressed to the Americans than they are to the Ukrainians. And the Americans, of course, are there in Istanbul. There are American representatives. What is happening at the moment is that the United States is preserving the appearance that this is a conflict between Ukraine and Russia. But it is increasingly admitting that it is actually a proxy war between America and Russia. General Kellogg, Donald Trump's peace envoy, has said this. Marco Rubio, the US Secretary of State, has said this. So we're going through this theater at the moment, and Istanbul is a theater. It's a show. It's the Russians putting forward their proposals, they're putting forward their memorandum, the Americans coming up with a 22-point plan, which they're pretending is a Ukrainian plan, but is really an American plan. So the two sides are exchanging documents, but the people who are really negotiating with each other are the Americans and the Russians. And this probably will evolve, be very complicated, because Washington is a very complicated place, and there are many different factions and groups there. But this is what is going on in Istanbul at the present time.
Should we consider what is provided by Ukraine as a US position or not? Or there is no clear US position yet?
No, it is a US position. The US doesn't want to make substantial concessions to Russia on the security system in Europe. It doesn't want to make long-term commitments to Russia about Ukraine itself. So what they are trying to do is to persuade the Russians to freeze the conflict. The Russians say that's not enough. We can't just freeze the conflict. We want a general settlement of the conflict, one that will bring peace, obviously, between us and Ukraine and end the proxy war, but one which will also result in a general re-examination of the security system in Europe.
From the reasonable point of view, it is, for myself, for instance, it is understandable why Russians avoiding freezing the conflict. At least because of the US administration could be changed in 3 years' time and the conflict could be resolved, regained again. So in that regards, do we have a solution? Do we have a really substantial solution for this conflict?
Yes, it's going to be very difficult to come to a solution about the Ukrainian aspects themselves. The only way that this can be solved properly is for the Americans and the Russians to talk about the general security situation in Europe. And this has been the underlying cause of the problem. When the Russians talk about root causes, this is this expression that they use all the time. That is what they mean. They mean the general security situation in Europe. Not just NATO expansion, which has been the major aggravating factor on the surface, but the expansion, the enormous expansion of American power that took place in Europe after the end of the Cold War, which has left the Russians feeling in a more insecure position than they had been previously.
In that regard, what is actually the meaning of this conflict for the global order? Because a lot of people say that the global order is changing right now, seriously changing, that the unipolar world has ended and we will be facing the new shape of the new world order. Does this conflict really has this kind of meaning?
Yes, it does. The United States, or at least some American officials, including President Trump and Secretary Rubio, have actually gone so far as to say this. They said that the unipolar moment has ended, that we are returning back to a situation of great power, politics, in other words, great power, an international system which is going to be multipolar as opposed to unipolar, and with the United States as one great power amongst several of them. And I think that if you can think of the Ukraine conflict in this way, it was the last attempt by the United States to try to assert a dominant position in world affairs. When the Ukrainian conflict, the military part of it, began in 2022, there was much talk about breaking Russia, defeating Russia in some way. Prime Minister Johnson of Britain said that Russia must be defeated and be seen to be defeated. So there was very much this rhetoric. And what the Americans have discovered is that they're now up against the limits of their power. This is beyond what they can do. And they understand that if they can't break Russia, which is the weaker great power, they can't break China either, militarily, in the same sort of way. So the United States is now having to readjust its foreign policies in recognition of the fact that the global system has changed and that it is now one great power, still the most powerful great power, but one great power that has to deal with several others.
And who are emerging in this multipolar?
Well, initially it's the United States, China and Russia are going to be the great powers. Now, the United States and China are the two big superpowers. Russia is not as powerful as the other two, but it does have powerful strategic assets. It's a major nuclear power. It has a huge territory. It's rich in natural resources. And of course, it is located strategically in Western Eurasia. And it has a political leadership that is determined to exert Russian power. So it remains a great power, but not equal to the other two.
Yes, this is a very important issue. Why not the bipolar world, but the multipolar world, if there are two major powers?
Yes. Well, there are elements of bipolarity starting to appear in the system, because what has happened, partly as a result of this conflict, but was already developing before, is that China and Russia have created their strategic partnership, and they've been coordinating increasingly closely on international relations, and their leaders, Putin and Xi Jinping, treat each other as friends, and there's a certain degree of economic integration between the two. But the Russians, nonetheless, probably because they've been a great power in the past, feel that they ought to be still a significant power in the present and in the immediate future. So even though there are elements of bipolarity, the Russians continue to insist on having an independent foreign policy. And of course, they also have their specific interests in Europe, in what they call Western Eurasia, in the Middle East, which are distinct from those that the Chinese have.
How much Russia has its power to remain the independent pole on this landscape?
This is a huge question, which only time can tell. I mean, there's an argument for saying that Russia is currently punching above its weight. Its population is much smaller than that of China and the United States. Its economy is smaller than that of China and the United States by a significant margin. It's got very strong technology. And as I said, it's very tremendous will, but whether it can sustain this for the long term is an open question. Russia has come back previously from difficult periods. Whether it be able to sustain this and come back in the same way, as I said, we simply don't know. But for the moment, for the next 5-10 years, it is going to remain a significant power. And we have to all accept and acknowledge that fact.
Usually when they say about the multipolarity, usually it is named China, US, and Russia. Yes. What about India? What about other powers?
Very much so. They're arguably growing as well. India is a very interesting case because it has all of the qualities that it needs in order to become a great power. It's got a huge population, much of it very dynamic and very innovative. It's got a big economy. It's got strategic reach. And of course it's got nuclear weapons. What India lacks is the self-confidence both to exert power far beyond its borders in ways that great powers do, and at the same time a certain lack of self-confidence in terms of its own development. Now, this is surprising to outsiders, but many people from India, including well-connected people in India, have told me this. So India is a great power in the making, but it is not there yet. In 10 years' time, it could quite easily take its place as a great power, but it still has some way to go.
And again, let's go back to for a while to the conflict in Ukraine. The main reason from the Russian side was named the enlargement of NATO. And even more, sometimes, and Trump has acknowledged that, he declared about that, and his representatives declared that. For instance, the Witkoff declared that, and many others. So can we say that this is the kind of, if we have a multipolar world, the era of NATO is over? The era of enlargement of NATO is over?
Yes, I think so. I think that what the Russians have done in Ukraine is that they have drawn a clear line. They accepted, they had to accept, because they were in a period of great weakness after the end of the Cold War, the expansion of NATO, and as they say themselves, the way they put it is the loss of their strategic space. But they've said, now that's enough. You can't go into Ukraine. We're prepared to resist you there. And of course, when we say the Russians, it isn't just the Russian political leadership. Russian society in general supports that stance. So NATO, as an expanding, growing power in the world, is running its course. And if we're moving into a multipolar system in which China is obviously the other great power relative against the United States, then of course NATO becomes far less significant to the United States itself, because despite attempts by some European leaders to involve NATO in Asian affairs, NATO's home isn't really there, and it isn't really very welcome there either.
What does it mean for the European security, Euro-Atlantic security, let's say so?
Yes, I mean, for the Europeans, this is going to be a major problem, because to the extent that the Cold War was a conflict between two superpowers, the Soviet Union and the United States, that was a conflict that took place in Europe. The Cold War was basically a conflict in Europe with many ramifications around the world, but Europe was central to it. And that was very useful in some ways for people, at least in Western Europe. Eastern Europe maybe less so, but in Western Europe, the United States was there. There was this extraordinary period of economic prosperity because the Americans were bankrolling Western Europe, and Europe was the key region in global affairs. Now that the center of the conflict is moving, global conflict is moving to Asia, and with NATO expansion having ended, the Europeans are worried that they could be faced with strategic irrelevance. And one of the reasons you see the Europeans so shrill and so active in talking up the threat to themselves from Russia is because they want to tell the Americans, you know, don't forget us. We're still here. The Russians are still there. They're still powerful. And you can't just forget about us. We still matter in some way. So, but this is part of the problem that Europe faces. It's got to start, I think, looking beyond the situation of great power rivalries and start to look at Europe itself and the region, and start thinking about security structures for the region which have a more European emphasis than, you know, being part of a global great power conflict that we've seen previously.
There are contradictory statements from the European side quite frequently, that on the one hand, Russia has a shortage of weaponry, shortage of people, and etc., etc. But on the other hand, they frequently say that Russia is going to attack NATO. Which is a real picture in that?
Neither is. I mean, first of all, Russia is not going to attack NATO. I mean, that is absurd. Why would Russia want to march on Berlin, for example? I mean, it makes absolutely no sense. And Russia doesn't have the power to do that. And the Russians know they don't have the power to do that. I mean, that would be World War III, and it would be insane, and it would involve the Russians in European affairs in ways that they don't want to be. So Russia has no plan to attack NATO. That is absurd. At the same time, what has also happened is that the Europeans have greatly underestimated Russian power and also Russian willpower. They assumed that the Russian economy was weaker and smaller and was not as industrially and technologically developed as it turned out to be. They underestimated Russia's ability to project power and to sustain a long war. And of course, they're alarmed by all of this because it turns out that Russia is still there. It is still a great power, maybe not equal to America and China, but certainly much more powerful than any European state. And this alarms them. So you can see this confusion and muddle and incoherence in the way that the Europeans approach this, and their inability to come to terms with the reality that Russia is, of course, there, but it isn't a threat to them in the way that they think it is, or want to pretend that it is.
If, for instance, Poland or any other kind of even Eastern European countries are a little bit far from the Russian borders, and there are the Belarus and Ukraine there, the Baltic states are really very next to it. And also there are some tensions in the Baltic Sea. What could happen?
This is, I think, the most dangerous region now is the Baltic Sea, because the Baltic states have massively overcommitted themselves to this anti-Russian policy. They started to do that from the moment they joined NATO. They have reasons for being hostile to Russia. I mean, we should not underestimate that. But they forgot that Russia is there constantly and that the United States is far away. And they've pursued an anti-Russian policy that has made Russia very antagonistic to them. So that's making them very nervous. And because they're becoming nervous, they are creating issues about the Baltic, and they're also persuading the Scandinavian states, which also have historic issues with Russia. Sweden, for example, has had many historic issues with Russia. So all of these countries in the Baltic are becoming very nervous and very frightened because they see the Russian giant waking up and looking like it's going to become very strong, and the Americans perhaps receding. And at the same time, there is this idea that maybe you can weaken Russia in some way by affecting its maritime trade, by preventing ships traveling from St. Petersburg and the Russian ports on the Baltic Sea. So intercepting ships, and that will create some kind of blockade there. And of course, the Russians will respond to all of this. So if this situation isn't brought under control very quickly, it could easily escalate into a major crisis. And it's the Americans who will have to do that. They will have to tell people in the Baltic, please calm down. This isn't as dangerous a situation with the Russians as you think. But if you continue to behave like that, then potentially it could become very dangerous indeed. And you mustn't assume in that case that we're going to be there for you in quite the way that you want us to be.
Can the new, it's not anymore the new, but anyway, the Trump's administration can calm down Baltics?
Well, in theory, yes. The great problem with the United States is that it has a very complicated political system. And I'm not talking here about the Constitution and the House of Representatives. I mean, it is a deeply factionalized political system. So you have different people who push in different directions, and you have some people who still have not accepted and probably will never accept the fact that the United States is no longer the leading power, the unipolar power, and who feel that the United States therefore has to take a very strong line against countries like Russia and support its allies and act in that kind of way. Because if it doesn't, then it's somehow betraying itself and what they believe the United States should be. Now that is a very influential voice of attitude within the United States, at least within the political leadership of the United States. Many, many people think this, and they feel that, as I said, if America doesn't assert itself strongly in that kind of way, then it's going to cease to have relevance, that the US idea, because they speak of the US as an idea as much as a country, which is a strange way of thinking, that idea will be betrayed in some ways. And every American president, Donald Trump, Joe Biden, Barack Obama, has to take that view into account.
In terms of the Baltics, because it's a really very tense region, and in terms of the Baltics, it's really very interesting how much NATO is a guarantee of safety of its members, especially the small countries which are on the very front line of these tensions between NATO and Russia. Despite what we have already said about that Russia has no plans to attack NATO, etc., despite of that, how much NATO brings safety and security to its members?
I think that in terms of the Baltic states, NATO has brought no security at all. I think it has been a trap. I think what happened was that the Baltic states entered NATO. They assumed that gave them absolute security against Russia. And I think that encouraged them to pursue this very anti-Russian policy, which is now becoming a major problem for them.
And now you mean including Sweden and Finland?
Well, it's Sweden and Finland, all of them. As I said, they've become incredibly anti-Russian because they feel they can be. And of course, the risk they run is that it will provoke a reaction from Russia, which could easily get out of control. And then, of course, the United States might not be willing to become involved in a war with Russia to protect Estonia or Finland in the way that these countries suppose. The best way to secure your interests, the Baltic states could have secured their independence and their freedom, was by coming to some kind of long-term understanding with Russia. It was a major mistake they made, that they thought that NATO could provide that protection instead of exercising proper diplomacy and foreign policy to establish a long-term relationship with Russia. Now that's an easy thing for someone like me to say, because obviously I'm looking at this from London, and I understand that in the Baltics people have different perspectives because of the history. But I think if you're being completely realistic about this, always remember that the Russians are your neighbors, and you have to take that reality into account in the future. And that if you ignore that reality and rely on guarantees given to you by a country that is a continent and an ocean away, then you're taking on enormous risks.
So like Canadians and Mexicans should take into account the same stuff?
Well, they should be careful. I mean, I'm not saying that they should subordinate themselves to the United States. I think the secret of politics for great powers is to act with moderation and restraint towards their neighbours. If they are very aggressive towards them, then that is ultimately going to be very bad for the great power itself, because it's going to involve it in all sorts of conflicts and issues which will eventually undermine its own power and its internal stability. The Soviet Union is a case in point, by the way. So the great powers need to act with realism and moderation in the way they deal with the countries around them. the countries around a great power also need to understand that this is a great power and that they need to act towards it with an understanding that as a great power, it has certain security and concerns which the smaller countries have to take into account in forming their own policy. If small countries around great powers work this intelligently, it can work out very well for them, just to say.
Since we get next to the small countries, and we are in a small country right now, in Georgia, so all these pictures, I mean, on one hand, the conflict in Ukraine, the reshaping the global order, and how to say that at least posing the enlargement of NATO, and etc. How should it be considered here from Georgian side, from Georgian perspective, in your point of view?
Well, first of all, Georgia has some of the same challenges that the Baltic states have, in that you are also very close to a great power, which is Russia. And the history between Georgia and Russia, as every Georgian knows, has been a very complicated and sometimes a very, very difficult one. I think Georgia, however, has understood the realities of this region and of this kind of politics probably better than the Baltic states. And I'm going to suggest that's probably because you're an ancient country with a very, very long history. Georgia has a long history of knowing how to maneuver between great powers. It goes all the way back to the Romans and the Byzantines and the Persians and all of these things. So I think you have more of an instinct for this. And I think that Georgia also is much better located than the Baltic states are, because you are not just neighbors of the great power. There are other powers around you. There is Turkey, there is Iran. Russia itself is part of the Eurasian world. The Eurasian world, of course, includes the Colossus, which is China. All of these countries are interested in Georgia. All of these countries want to see Georgia do well, each for their completely different and sometimes competing reasons. So Georgia is actually very strategically located, in my opinion, to make the most of its geographical and cultural position. And in this multipolar system that is developing, it can thrive.
In terms of the new multipolar shape of the new world order, so how we can assess the situation for the countries like Georgia. I mean, the South Caucasus and the Central Asia, for instance, is the kind of region where the major competition could still be conducted in the future. It is not ended already, because we have now the new shape. So that means that the big powers will compete to each other in several regions, and the Caucasus and the Central Asia is one of them. So what we have, the problems are still ahead, or we have already passed them?
Right. The first thing to say is that great power competition is a given. It will always exist. Great powers will always maneuver to some extent for advantage over each other. The issue is whether that great power competition is managed intelligently and successfully by the great powers themselves. Now, this is where the smaller powers have a very important role, because partly they can educate the great powers. That may sound strange, but it isn't, because great powers have to interact with the leaders of the smaller countries. The smaller countries can explain to them, look, this is our limits. We are not prepared to retreat beyond this. If you pushed us too hard, too strongly, we will resist, and then we will perhaps tilt more towards the other great power that might be your rival. So small powers actually, in situations of great power competition, can actually work it very successfully and to their advantage. And yes, there is competition. There's competition between China and Russia in Central Asia. There is competition between China and Russia in the Caucasus as well. That doesn't mean that China and Russia don't at the same time have a lot of cooperation with each other. China and Russia do not want to be rivals and adversaries again, as they were in the 1960s, because it worked out very badly for each of them in the 1960s. They became tied down in a conflict which only worked to the advantage of the Americans. So this creates a framework, whereas as a small powers, which themselves have a clear understanding of their own interests, can maneuver very successfully. So you can get good economic relations with China. You can get, at the same time, a friendly relationship with Turkey and Iran, because nobody will want to just surrender Georgia to the other. Just to give an example.
It's on one hand, it is optimistic. On the other hand, it is kind of what is the main threat is coming from, that it is when the big powers are competing to each other, they are competing not straight to each other, but using the proxy places.
Yes.
And the small countries on the border are usually used as the proxies. So how should we avoid this threat from ourselves? Because actually they usually, at least Ukraine could not do that. We could not do that in 2008. Yes. And for instance, it was miracles that we can avoid the big power clash in Caribbean, in Cuba crisis then, and so on. So usually these small countries are used as a proxies for in these great power struggles and great power competition. What we should do to avoid at least this threat. I mean, it is big question how to use this competition to further develop yourself as a small country. But the first and foremost, it is crucial to survive.
The best guarantee of a country's independence is its successful domestic development, by which I mean, developing the society, creating a strong education system, creating a strong health system. Countries that do well in that way and which are politically stable manage generally to function more successfully in this kind of system of great power competition. So internal domestic development is perhaps the single most important thing. If you have divisions within your society, if your society becomes divided into factions, then that is very dangerous. I could give an example. My own previous country, ethnic Greek. In the early 20th century, we had different factions in Greece. There was even a party which called itself the Russian Party because it was pro-Russian. And that was a disaster. And it involved Greece in all kinds of conflicts, which ended very badly for us. So Georgia needs to be itself. It needs to be proudly and strongly and assertively independent, and that will attract respect from all of the countries around it, including the great powers. Now, any international system, if it is going to succeed, depends on the rationality of the people who are running the system. And I'm afraid the reality is that no system, there is no such thing in humanity as, protecting completely against irrationality, illogical behavior, ideological madness, things of that kind. We can't, unfortunately, abolish history. I mean, that is part of history. But we can take the situation that we have and use it successfully to our advantage. And at this particular moment in time, China and Russia are rationally led. They understand the limits of their own power. The United States is somewhat more unstable, it seems to me at the moment, but it's further away. So I think that this is a good moment for Georgia to use, to do what I said, to develop its society, its economy, its political system, its educational system. And the stronger you get that way, even as a small country, the stronger you become relative to all the others.
Finally, are you optimistic about that?
I'm very optimistic about Georgia and the situation here in the Caucasus. I think the most dangerous period has passed. I think that there was a real crisis in 2008, which might have got completely out of control, and thankfully it didn't. Georgia did suffer as a result of this, but it came through in the end, and it's still here, and it's thriving, if I can say. So you need to build on this. So I'm optimistic about Georgia. I'm reasonably optimistic about the situation in the southern Caucasus, but there are issues. There's still Turkey and Armenia, there's Armenia and Azerbaijan, there's all sorts of things. Now, about the international system in general, I think I am relatively optimistic in that I think that the unipolar moment was unique and it was dangerous because it created temptations for the United States, which the United States was not able to resist. It believed that because it had this unique power, it should use it to try to shape the future indefinitely, and I think that was too much for any single country to do. So it's good that we are leaving that period behind us, and I think that the multipolar system that we're going to start to see develop, at least for the next 20, 30, 50 years, will actually be more stable than the system that we have had since the Cold War.
One more question about Georgia, because you were quite frequently publishing and talking and analyzing what was happening in Tbilisi during this period of after the elections, the protests in the streets and etc. So what do you think right now, since you are here in Tbilisi and it's your first visit here, and what is your expression of local politics?
Right, well, I have only been here for a short time, and as you rightly say, I've never been to Georgia before, but this is my impression. I went out in Georgia, in Tbilisi. The city seemed to be relaxed, and my overall impression was that the situation is stable, that it is more stable, considerably more stable than is understood in the West. So I think that a dangerous moment was reached. I think that point of danger has passed. I think that the situation will calm, and I think that Georgia, having achieved a degree of stability and prosperity and a situation where people feel that they can start thinking about the future and planning for the future, they will not want to risk that stability again. So the more the stability continues, the more consolidated it becomes, the more everything else starts to come together and everything starts to work properly. So I think that I was impressed. I thought as a Georgia, Tbilisi much more relaxed than I expected. No visible police presence, no sign of posters or things of that kind. I've been to countries which are unstable and fractured, and Tbilisi didn't seem to me to be that sort of place.
How do you think that, would they understand, would they realize in West what you have said about right now, about the situation here?
No, is the short answer, because of course the narrative has been so different. And unfortunately, we haven't discussed narratives, but of course in the West we're very keen on narratives. And the narrative that has been promoted and accepted throughout the media here is that this is a very deeply divided society, that the government is perhaps not very stable, that the government itself is controlled by the Russians, which is an absurd theory, but you actually hear it said and written. And the moment you are here itself, you discover that the situation is completely otherwise, which is why it is important, by the way, that you have visitors from the West coming to Georgia so that they can see for themselves what I have seen, that on the contrary, the situation is stable and becoming more so.
What is the main reason for that narrative? What do you think about it?
Well, we talked about proxies and proxy wars and that kind of thing. I think this is partly the cause of this, is that there are people in the West, and especially in Washington, but also to some extent in London, who want to see countries act like pawns in this very intricate chess games that they play with each other. And they assumed that Georgia was going to play the role of one of these pawns. So they're very angry that that hasn't happened. To them it is unnatural that it shouldn't be so, because they assumed that Georgia was aligned in that way with them. And I think that this anger expressed itself in the media, in the discussions that took place. And of course, it can't be the Georgians themselves who have made these decisions in their own interests and in the interests of their own country and to preserve their own stability. It must be the hand of Moscow that is somehow pulling the strings here when it isn't, in fact, pulling the strings here. So this is, I think, why it came, because of frustration that Georgia has refused to be used as a pawn in the way that the West expected that it would agree to be.
So some people here are optimistic about the, how to say, that elite change in West, and then maybe it could become settled, the relations, I mean, the Georgian relations, Georgia's relations with West and etc. Do you have this kind of optimism regarding the West?
Yes, in the end I do. It will take time. We've become very used in the West, and I say we because I'm a Westerner, I mean, I live in London. So we have become very used to being the dominant power in the world, and we've been that for a very, very long time. If we're talking about the power of the United States, it has been the constant throughout my life. Very difficult for people in the West to imagine a system in which the United States is not dominant. So once we get over this, once we understand that we are not as great and mighty and all-powerful as we were, then I think we will start to be more realistic, and we will start to take a more understanding view of what is happening in other countries, including in Georgia. And that will be a very, very good thing for us, can I just say? Because this idea all the time that we are the great power is what it's doing, and we're not going to discuss this in this program, but it is causing serious damage to our own societies. We are sacrificing an awful lot of things that made us the economically successful countries that we used to be, because we believe that we have some kind of right to decide what happens in places like Tbilisi, which is a huge distraction of mental energy and moral energy away from where it ought to be concentrated, which is in our own affairs.
Final question. How much outcomes of the Ukrainian conflict can help you to realize that?
Well, I think if it makes us understand the limits of our own power, then it will probably play an important role in making us understand that. We're going to go through a difficult period in the West. I mean, in Europe, as I said, the fact that we're not the center of the world, as we have been since the 16th century, is going to be very difficult. The fact that we're going to have to come to terms with the Russians at some point is going to be very difficult as well, because all European states have had issues with the Russians, including all the West European states. I mean, you look at this colossus in the East, and how do you develop a long-term relationship with it? No leader in Europe so far has understood or realized how to do that. With the Americans gone, with our power diminishing, we're going to have to think about these things. But eventually, once we've done that, once we've come through this process, we will discover that we have an awful lot. We have our own culture, our own history, our own tremendous sources of wealth. We have our great cities, our architecture, our arts, our history, our religion. And then at that point, we will probably start to come out of this dream and start to face reality. And reality is always better than illusion.
Mr. Mercouris, it was great to have you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.